Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk. And in this episode of God Talk, I want to talk about being a fool for Christ. I spend my life trying to not do foolish things and look like a fool, but sometimes to no avail. But what about when it comes to being a fool for Christ? What do you think about that? It's not easy being used by God and for God. Teaching a Bible study on Wednesday nights, going through the Bible, and we're kind of to the section of the prophets, and the prophets are kind of interesting because, man, I have to tell you, I thank God regularly, at least in my mind, that I was not called to be a prophet, especially a prophet in the Old Testament, because regularly they had to do some foolish things, and you may not be aware of some of the foolish things they did, but let me just kind of enlighten you. The prophet Ezekiel. So the prophet Ezekiel, he had to lay on his left side for 390 days. And that was to point out the sin of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, I have to tell you, I can't lay on my side for longer than 10 minutes to an hour before I have to flip around and move. And when I sleep or I'm sitting still, I'm like a rotisserie chicken. I got to move around or I just get really stiff and achy. And so I hope Ezekiel was fairly young when God asked him to do that, but 390 days on this left side. And then much more doable, but still impossible in my own mind, God had him then turn and lie 40 days on his right side to signify the sin of Judah, the southern part of Israel. Not only that, but God actually commanded Ezekiel to bake and eat bread that was cooked over human excrement, cooked over human poop. Now, Ezekiel actually kind of refused God on that, and that he would defile himself. He'd be unclean, and not to mention, how nasty is that? So God relented and told him he could use cow poop. So those are some crazy things that Ezekiel did as he was declaring the message of the Lord to the people of Israel. Isaiah is an interesting one. Isaiah, there's a ton of really good messianic prophecies that's found in Isaiah, another one of the great prophets. And, well, what did God ask of Isaiah? He asked him to walk around naked, or mostly naked, for 3 years. And there was a point to that. There was a point to the fact that Israel was relying on Egypt to be their defender from other enemies. They would have an alliance with Egypt. They would pay Egypt to come and help them fight their battles. Egypt was a great power, and Isaiah is prophesying against Egypt. He's prophesying against Israel, and God's having them do it basically naked so that they would understand that they can't look to Egypt for their deliverance. They're naked without God. Man alive. No one wants to see that, and I am glad that, for 3 years, I don't think you recover from that, do you? How about the prophet Hosea? Hosea is another interesting one. Now, compared to lying on your side for 390 days and walking around naked for 3 years, I guess this one's not as bad, but man, it would be tough as well. God had Hosea marry a prostitute to show that Israel was prostituting themselves with foreign gods and so forth. And so not only does God have him marry a prostitute, it's not like when he married the prostitute, she stopped her prostitution. It's kind of assumed that she continued with it. And so as she had kids with Hosea, and I say with Hosea in quotations, because the understanding is they really weren't Hosea's kids, but not only was he called to love this prostitute wife and show love, he's called to love his kids, and the children were called not loved, and another was not my people. I mean, that's what the children were called. And why did God have Hosea do that? Well, to show that, as Hosea is showing love to his wife, who's a prostitute with other men, having kids that probably were not his own, yet he still showed love to them. Beautiful gospel illustration that God was still loving Israel in the midst of their unfaithfulness. But man, alive, like, could you imagine to have to do any one of those things, either what Ezekiel endured or Isaiah endured in terms of the embarrassment, or Hosea endured because of the pain that he's with a woman who doesn't even love him, who's constantly having an affair with him and bearing kids that probably were not even his own. I say all that because we're a week removed, a week and one day, I think, from the whole dramatic events that revolved around Charlie Kirk's death. And who could have thought? Who could have thought the national reaction to it? And it's encouraging in one respect, in that, like, for all the wicked people who celebrate the persecution of the people of God and the church and acts of good, and that normally the people that celebrate evil, as they've tried to celebrate the death of Charlie Kirk, there has been, even from like Democrats, right? Even from the left, even from what we would normally consider more maybe liberal institutions, there's been a pretty big backlash to that evil and that wickedness. One story I heard is, like, there's a protester, a student, I think it was at Texas Tech, who was mocking a bunch of people that were having kind of a memorial service for Charlie Kirk, and she got arrested, and I don't know if she got expelled. Just heard that Jimmy Kimmel is being pulled by ABC for some of the comments that he made, and like, I could go on and on. I mean, I think I've heard at least 20 different stories of people who've been fired and lost their source of income for things that they've posted or things that they've said celebrating the death of this man Charlie Kirk. Who could have thought that, like just a year ago, that would not be the case? And so there are some issues in terms of free speech that even being on the right, like, we need to be concerned about, because, like, rightfully so, we protested against, like, our free speech being taken away under a different administration. But like, I don't ever, people like to say, well, when George Floyd died, people didn't lose their jobs for celebrating that. I don't recall anyone celebrating it. I think there are people on the right said, listen, this was a really bad man who was, on drugs, and at the time that he had his heart attack, or whatever his official cause of death was, and let's not, like, make this guy out to be a hero. But I don't remember anyone. I don't remember anyone celebrating it. And so, it gets into that in terms of the free speech, the whole thing, like, well, what's free speech and what is just wicked and evil? And I'll tell you, it is somewhat refreshing to see evil being not only frowned upon, but trying to, stamp it out. This to me is a good thing. Because evil has, just invaded and just infiltrated every aspect of our country. And so, why am I kind of bringing in Charlie Kirk with what I've said about Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Hosea? Well, because, people thought what Charlie Kirk was saying was foolishness, hate speech, and a bunch of these other things. And that's the real interesting thing. Like, he wasn't at all. Like, he was speaking truth. I wasn't a huge follower of him. I mean, I had a favorable opinion towards him, but I didn't follow him. I didn't listen to him regularly. But I've had more people, send me more and more clips where I've heard more and more of it, and just hearing, like, how his wife spoke about him and so forth. Like, he wasn't just for, he wasn't a political activist. He was really for truth. He was really for trying to lead people ultimately to Jesus. And this is what God called the prophets to do. And in the same way that it seemed foolish that Ezekiel's laying on his side to the people, certainly, or that he's eating, bread baked over crap. You've got, Isaiah walking around naked. You got Hosea, married to a prostitute, having kids that aren't his own. Like all of that is foolishness. Just like people thought, what people on the left, certainly the extreme left, believed that what Charlie Kirk was saying was foolishness, but it wasn't. It's just that which comes from the Lord oftentimes seems like foolishness. Now, I don't know that Charlie Kirk thought of himself as a prophet. I like I said, I didn't follow him, and certainly never had a conversation with him. But in a sense, he wasn't he? Because he was warning about the ramifications of the rampant evil that has befallen our land, that we had fallen into a state in which we were certainly calling that which is wicked good and that which was good wicked. But he didn't do it in an offensive way. He didn't do it in a disrespectful way. He tried to do it through debate and mutual respect. But yet that seemed as foolishness to many in this country, and led not only to someone assassinating him, but a bunch of people trying to celebrate that assassination. And so, the prophets in the Bible, many of them were killed, and many of the wicked in Israel at the time in which they were killed celebrated the death of the prophets. So I think even though he wouldn't probably have called himself a prophet, I'm saying there's a lot of connections there and a lot of comparisons there. Not only, I would say, a prophet, because he suffered a prophet's death, and that which he was saying and doing seemed like foolishness to many in our society, but even beyond what I would say is a prophet, he was certainly a martyr. And this is what that we have to keep in mind. And I mentioned in last week's podcast, right after the event, and I do apologize, that I did that immediately after, so I didn't know any of the facts. I still feel like the podcast pretty much held up to the facts as they unraveled, but give me a little grace. That was recorded 15 minutes after, and honestly, it stayed pretty true to the narrative of what ultimately unfolded. But what I said in that is we've got to be better than them. And what I've noticed is that, like, for the most part, when it comes to the martyrs, it's the fact that we don't fight back. It's the fact that we're willing to be a fool. You see, they're laughing at Charlie Kirk because he had pretty much his head, his neck explode, his head blown off. Like, they're laughing like somehow he got what he deserved. Well, that's part of the foolishness of God. Like they think he's the fool, but actually he's not the fool, because it has brought so many people to listen to his material and his speeches that never were exposed to before. In his death, he's become much more impactful and influential than in his life. Same thing happened to Jesus, right? Jesus had followers and had a growing number of followers, so much so that they're lying in the streets singing, "Hosanna, son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And evil tries to snuff that out, right? But in snuffing that out, what they do is not only accomplish God's purpose of the sacrifice of the Holy Lamb of God for the sins of mankind, but it lights a fire under the message of Christ, and then his followers are being put to death, and they're willingly going to their death for that message, and that has a powerful effect. Charlie didn't have a chance to fight back against that bullet. He was dead before he even heard the sound of the shot. But yet, I would hope that he wouldn't even want to fight back against it, because by willingly going to your death, you just give such great credence and attention to the to the message that you're proclaiming, the message of Jesus Christ. If you think about the early Christians who went to the lion's den and they found themselves dying, like rumor had it that they were dying with smiles on their face, but the fact that they weren't fighting against the lions, they weren't kicking and screaming as they were being sent to their death. The Apostle Paul willingly went to his death, was beheaded for the message of Jesus Christ. All the apostles, it appears as foolishness. Their message appears as foolishness. They try to silence it. In their mind, they look like the fool got what a fool deserves, a fool's death. But actually, it's quite the opposite, isn't it? And so my question to all of you is this, like, it's not easy being used by God. I mean, if you think it's easy being used by God, you've got another thing coming. It's not easy being a fool for Christ. And once again, I put that word in quotation marks. Like, listen to my words and listen to this podcast. I use words like this all the time. Don't take it out of context. Like, I certainly, like, none of these were fools, but that's how they're perceived by evil and by those who would oppose God and His will. So my question is how are you willing to be a fool for Christ? How are you willing to allow God to use you? Because if you think that that means an easy life, you've bought into the lie of Satan, in which he's silenced the church. And this is the amazing thing. Like, I'm encouraged to see this. I mean, for 10, 15 years, like, I've been protesting loudly through the sign and through my sermons that we're a church that stands on truth. And I'm constantly giving a message that's opposite of what the church has been giving. But unfortunately, with the church, they, like, follow whatever, like, the ways of the world are. Like, whatever's popular in culture, that's what they follow. And now that truth is becoming popular, you're hearing more and more churches actually speaking the truth. And it's not a good thing because the church is following society, but it is a good thing because the church has lost this voice that now hopefully they will get back. But how are you willing to be a fool for Christ? Are you willing to be a fool for Christ when it comes to your speech? Are you willing to say what sounds like nonsense to your unbelieving friends, your unbelieving relatives, your unbelieving neighbors? Like, are you willing to say things uh, that that just don't seem to make sense? To share your faith. I was at a funeral this past week, and my nephew has a relative that isn't a believer, and I was willing to speak foolishness to that individual to try to help them to understand that God is real, and that they're totally misunderstanding and totally missing the boat. And I know she didn't, like, really believe it. I know she didn't understand it, but I encouraged her that, you know what, I won't try to convert you, but if at some point you want to have just an intellectual debate on this, like, this family member of yours, this loved one would love nothing more than for you to become a believer in Jesus Christ. Are you willing to be a fool for Christ when it comes to your job? Are you willing to say, no, I'm not going to do that? That this might be typical within the industry, but according to my faith, I can't lie to the client. I can't do this. I can't work on such and such day. I am going to observe my Sabbath, the Sabbath, whether that's Sunday or whatever day you're able to take it. Are you willing to sound like a fool? Holidays are coming up, and we're going to have all kinds of conversations with all different kinds of extended family over Thanksgiving meals and Christmas meals and so forth. And certainly there's going to be people that are going to be ideologically have a much more liberal worldview than you. They might not even be believers. Are you willing to speak up? Are you willing to be a fool for Christ, even if that means maybe you don't get invited to the family meal the next year, even if that makes a few people during the family meal a little uncomfortable? Now, I always tell everyone, speak the truth in love. I'm not giving you permission. I'm not encouraging you to be a jerk. You do not need to be a jerk. In fact, when you're a jerk, you make the church look bad, you make Christ look bad, and you make yourself look bad. Don't be a jerk, but speak the truth in love. And ultimately, I think one of the ways that we ultimately look like a fool for God is when we lose our life for Him. And I say we look like a fool because it's like, you know what? If you would just kept your mouth shut, you fool, you'd still be alive. You got what you deserved, didn't you? Well, that was pretty foolish to do. That was pretty foolish to say. And it's kind of like, you die and they think you're a fool because of it. No, in fact, you're not a fool when you die for Christ. And are you willing to lose your life for it? I don't know. Like, I always had, like, an inclination from a very young age, like even before I was a pastor, probably in my teens, I always had an inclination I might die for my faith. Even before religious persecution and all that other stuff. I can't explain that well, I really should. I mean, I'm not that controversial, but I have made some people mad. I've made some people mad as I've had to ask certain people step out of roles of leadership because they don't have a heart of Christ. I've made some people mad when, by things I've put on the sign and certainly things that I've said. It's certainly not hate speech, but people hear it as that. But I like to think I'm reasonable. I like to say I speak the truth in love. But for me, like, if I would much rather die for being a fool for Christ. I would much rather die because um, uh, of persecution for my beliefs than a whole lot of other ways that a person could die. I can think of 100. I could think of 1,000 different ways that I'd rather not die. But may I be found, dead doing the Lord's work, and I can't think of anything more noble. I can't think of anything, honestly, that I can't think of a better way of dying. So, in terms of Charlie Kirk, yeah, we grieve his death, but he was a prophet for the Lord, really, even though he didn't see himself as that. He was a martyr for the Lord, and the last words out of his mouth was proclaiming the message of truth and trying to attest to the love of God and the truth of God. Wouldn't that be how you want to die? And so my challenge to all of us is, sometimes it's not easy to be used by God. And oftentimes when we're used by God, we look like a fool for God, but we know that, in fact, what is foolishness to man is the wisdom of our God in heaven. So I encourage you, as we continue to grieve the loss of Charlie Kirk, celebrate that he died being a fool for Christ, being a servant of God, and whether or not we have the opportunity to do that in our own lives, hopefully through your speech, through your job, through your family, through a variety of different ways, you can figure out ways that you can be a fool for Christ as well. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of God Talk. I look forward to talking to you again next week. God bless and have a great day.